Grayson County, Texas, April 1895. As settlers hurried to establish their homesteads before planting season, Joseph Carrigan remained fixated on digging a hole in the ground. Now, in his sixth week of excavation, the 42-year-old newcomer from Illinois had barely started on his crops, while neighbors had already broken soil for corn and cotton. His peculiar project puzzled longtime residents like Thomas Jenkins, who had survived 15 Texas summers without such elaborate precautions. "What in tarnation are you building, Carrigan? A dance hall underground?" Jenkins called out one afternoon, leaning against his wagon as he passed the massive excavation taking shape on Carrigan's newly claimed land. The hole measured 12 feet wide by 16 feet long, with a depth reaching 8 feet below ground level. Standard storm cellars throughout Grayson County rarely exceeded 8 feet by 8 feet, just enough space for a family to huddle during brief storms and store preserves during calmer weather. Carrigan's excavation would consume 768 cubic feet of valuable farmland compared to the conventional 240 cubic feet, a difference that struck established settlers as wasteful extravagance. "Storm cellar," Carrigan replied, without interrupting his methodical digging. His forearms, tanned and muscled from weeks of excavation, strained as he lifted another shovelful of dense clay soil. "Just building it proper is all." Benjamin Colbert, whose carpentry skills had produced 7 of the county's most reliable storm cellars, stopped by the following day to observe the unusual construction. Colbert's reputation rested on efficient designs that balanced protection with practical use of limited resources. His standard approach called for a simple 8-foot square excavation, requiring exactly 14 days of labor for an average man working alone. "6 weeks digging and you're not even ready for timber work," Colbert remarked, calculating the labor inefficiency with visible disapproval. "An 8x8 keeps folks safe enough in these parts, has for 20 years. The mathematical burden of Carrigan's project became increasingly apparent as April progressed. Where Colbert's design required approximately 12 support timbers for adequate bracing, Carrigan had already purchased 36 oak beams from the sawmill in Sherman. Each beam required individual placement according to a diagram Carrigan had sketched, based on principles unfamiliar to local builders. The additional 24 timbers represented weeks of extra labor and expense that conventional wisdom deemed unnecessary. Sheriff Miller, whose position made him de facto community leader in unincorporated portions of the county, watched Carrigan's project with growing concern. Miller had overseen the area's development since 1885, guiding newcomers toward established building practices that had served the region well. "Come tornado season, you'll wish you'd put that effort into your crops instead of digging half your farm away," Miller predicted during his weekly patrol. 8x8 has sheltered plenty through Texas twisters. The criticism intensified as neighboring families completed spring planting, while Carrigan continued excavating his oversized cellar. Jenkins' corn already stood knee-high, while Colbert had finished reinforcing his own modest storm cellar in just 3 days of maintenance work. Community gatherings at Walnut Creek Church buzzed with speculation about the strange northerner, who seemed to believe he understood Texas weather better than those who'd endured it for decades. "My father survived the '73 cyclone in Illinois," Carrigan explained when pressed during Sunday services. "Learned there's different ways to build for different winds. Texas twisters blow harder than anything you've measured." His neighbors exchanged knowing glances. Another newcomer with grand theories about local conditions he hadn't yet experienced. A man who would learn, perhaps at considerable cost, that generations of Texas experience counted for more than northern notions about proper construction. What did this Illinois farmer know about Texas weather that 15-year residents had failed to discover? What calculations drove him to sacrifice valuable planting weeks for an underground room 3 times larger than necessity demanded? The questions lingered unanswered as spring planting season gave way to early growth, with Carrigan's massive excavation standing as testament to either remarkable foresight or foolish obstinance in the face of established wisdom. By early May 1895, The technical specifications of Carrigan's controversial project became the primary subject of conversation at Thornton's General Store. Unlike conventional storm cellars designed primarily for food preservation with secondary protection, Carrigan was constructing what he called a cyclone shelter, with features unfamiliar to local builders. The entrance design particularly confused Benjamin Colbert, whose standard construction featured straightforward steps descending directly into the chamber. Offset entrance with two 90-degree turns, Colbert explained to curious neighbors, shaking his head. Claims it prevents wind pressure from building up inside. Extra work for no practical benefit, if you ask me. Carrigan's entrance indeed required an additional 80 cubic feet of excavation beyond the main chamber, creating a zigzag path that added nearly 8 days to his construction timeline. The technical principle he described, preventing direct wind funneling, contradicted conventional wisdom that prioritized simple access for rapid emergency use. Sheriff Miller expressed particular concern about elderly residents navigating such a complex entrance during actual storms. "Man's building a labyrinth, not a shelter," Miller remarked after inspecting the site. "In 20 years of Texas twisters, I've never seen wind pressure collapse a proper cellar door. It's flying debris you worry about, not air pressure." The ventilation system Carrigan incorporated sparked equal confusion, where standard shelters featured a single air pipe extending 12 inches above ground level. His design called for 4 separate 3-inch diameter pipes, positioned at precise intervals around the perimeter, each extending 18 inches above ground and capped with specially fabricated metal covers. "Air circulation prevents suffocation if you're trapped down there," Carrigan explained, while carefully positioning the pipes. Illinois cyclone of '83 trapped the Hendersons for 6 hours, found them unconscious from bad air when rescuers arrived. Thomas Jenkins calculated the material waste allowed whenever neighbors gathered: 4 ventilation pipes instead of 1, 36 support timbers instead of 12, reinforced corners requiring custom-cut bracing, all to solve problems we've never encountered in 15 seasons of Texas weather. The corner bracing technique particularly baffled local builders. Carrigan insisted on diagonal supports at precisely 45-degree angles in each of the cellar's 8 corners, creating a complex structural web that distributed pressure throughout the entire framework rather than relying on vertical posts alone. This approach required precisely cutting each timber to specific lengths: 81 inches for ceiling braces, 42 inches for corner supports, measurements that seemed arbitrary to observers familiar with simpler construction. "Learned it from my father," Carrigan explained while demonstrating the technique to skeptical onlookers. He studied the Springfield cyclone aftermath in '76. Every cellar with standard post supports collapsed when directional pressure exceeded timber strength. Diagonal bracing distributes force across multiple points. Jenkins remained unconvinced. "Your Illinois notions don't account for Texas clay soil. Different ground entirely." By late May, Carrigan had completed only the structural framework, while most neighbors had already begun harvesting early vegetables. His delayed agricultural progress became a subject of community concern, with some suggesting the newcomer might require assistance if his obsessive shelter construction left insufficient time for proper farming. A moderate thunderstorm in early June provided the first test of competing shelter designs. Wind gusts reaching 45 miles per hour swept through the county, sending families briefly into their cellars as a precaution. Jenkins and Colbert emerged after 20 minutes, finding their standard structures had performed exactly as designed. Carrigan remained below ground for nearly an hour, methodically checking each brace and ventilation pipe, while measuring air circulation with a small paper device that puzzled observers. "Testing pressure differentials," he explained afterward, recording figures in a leather-bound notebook. "Confirming cross-ventilation functions under moderate wind conditions." The successful performance of conventional shelters during this modest storm seemed to validate community skepticism. If standard construction withstood typical Texas weather without incident, what purpose could Carrigan's elaborate modifications possibly serve? What invisible threat justified 42 days of excavation instead of 14, 36 support timbers instead of 12, and complex ventilation systems protecting against hazards no one had experienced in decades of local settlement? By late July 1895, Carrigan's controversial storm cellar reached completion, standing in stark contrast to conventional shelters throughout Grayson County. Where standard designs focused on simple functionality, his finished structure featured innovations that bewildered local builders. The heavy double-door entrance, constructed from 2-inch oak planks instead of the typical 1-inch pine, swung outward rather than inward, a design choice Carrigan insisted was critical. Inward opening doors can be blocked by debris, he explained during an informal tour for curious neighbors. Outward opening design means you won't get trapped below ground. The interior space revealed carefully considered dimensions that Carrigan had calculated based on both protection and capacity needs. The 12-foot by 16-foot chamber provided 192 square feet of usable space compared to the standard 64 square feet, a difference that initially struck observers as excessive until Carrigan demonstrated its purpose. Standard shelter holds a family of 5 in cramped conditions, he noted, while arranging 5 chairs in a tight cluster. Mine accommodates 15 people with room for critical supplies. Thomas Jenkins scoffed at the demonstration. 15 people? You've got a family of 5. Planning to invite the whole county for dinner down there? Carrigan smiled patiently. Storms don't check how many folks live in each house before they hit. Neighbors help neighbors when trouble comes. The ventilation system proved particularly impressive during the August heat. While standard cellars became stifling within minutes of occupancy, Carrigan's 4-pipe design maintained surprisingly comfortable air circulation, even with 8 visitors inside. Benjamin Colbert, despite his ongoing skepticism, found himself taking notes about the cross-ventilation principles at work. Air flows in through the northern pipes, out through the southern ones, Carrigan explained, holding a thin cloth near each opening to demonstrate the gentle but consistent airflow. Creates natural circulation without mechanical assistance. Sheriff Miller examined the reinforced corners with growing interest, particularly the way each diagonal brace transferred weight to the surrounding support structure, rather than relying on individual load-bearing posts. My father tested these principles after every major Illinois storm, Carrigan explained. Found that standard vertical supports failed at 85 pounds per square inch of lateral pressure. This diagonal system withstands up to 140 pounds. A moderate September thunderstorm provided the first practical test of competing cellar designs. 3 families took shelter briefly as wind gusts reached 50 miles per hour. Jenkins and Colbert reported satisfactory performance of their standard shelters, though both noted minor water seepage around entrance seals. Carrigan's family emerged completely dry, the offset entrance having prevented wind-driven rain from reaching the main chamber. Water intrusion compromises structural integrity over time, Carrigan noted while inspecting his bone-dry timber bracing. Wet wood loses 40% of its strength after repeated moisture exposure. The mild autumn weather that followed seemed to validate the critics' position that standard construction adequately addressed regional threats. October brought clear skies and gentle breezes, with not a single day requiring cellar use for any family. November passed similarly uneventful, and December's cold temperatures presented challenges unrelated to storm protection. All that extra work, and what's he got to show for it? Jenkins remarked during the Christmas social at Walnut Creek Church. An oversized root cellar that's seen less use than my chicken coop. Winter passed without incident. January and February brought typical seasonal weather patterns without severe storms. Local farmers turned their attention to spring planting preparations, with storm cellar construction falling to the bottom of priority lists throughout the community. Sheriff Miller's attention shifted to minor boundary disputes and occasional rowdiness in Sherman's saloons. Come tornado season, he'll see that 8x8 would have been plenty, Colbert predicted as March arrived with gentle rains. Texas weather isn't Illinois weather, no matter how many fancy diagrams a man carries in his notebook. What remained unspoken was the question lingering in everyone's mind. Had Carrigan wasted precious resources on protection against a threat that would never materialize? Or did his elaborate precautions address dangers that conventional wisdom had simply never encountered? The true test of competing designs would require weather conditions far beyond the modest storms that had brushed the county since his arrival. April 1896 announced its arrival with troubling atmospheric signs that experienced farmers recognized as unusual. Barometric pressure readings in Sherman dropped to 29.2 inches, well below seasonal averages, while temperature fluctuations swung from 82 degrees at midday to 58 by evening, conditions that meteorologists at the nascent Weather Bureau had recently associated with severe storm formation. The telegraph office in Sherman began receiving weather advisories from Dallas, warning of cyclonic development possible across north-central Texas counties. Joseph Carrigan monitored these changes with methodical attention. His leather-bound notebook now contained daily barometric readings alongside temperature and wind direction observations, a practice his neighbors initially dismissed as northern fastidiousness, but now observed with growing interest. On April 12th, Carrigan began stocking his cellar with supplies calculated for extended occupancy. 15 gallons of water, provisions for 3 days, medical supplies, lanterns with extra kerosene, he explained to Sheriff Miller, who had stopped by with questions about the weather bulletins arriving from Dallas. Standard procedure when conditions align for severe systems. Miller nodded thoughtfully, his earlier skepticism softened by the official warnings now posted at the county courthouse. Telegraph says there's been destructive winds in Oklahoma Territory. 3 farms lost buildings yesterday near Ardmore. Thomas Jenkins maintained his practical approach to storm preparation. His 8x8 cellar, which had served adequately through 15 seasons of Texas weather, received its standard spring maintenance, a fresh application of tar along the entrance seams and testing of the single ventilation pipe to ensure it remained clear of obstructions. Been through plenty of spring blows, Jenkins told his concerned wife after reading the posted warnings. Our cellar's weathered worse than whatever's brewing. Benjamin Colbert approached the situation with professional confidence. His reputation rested on building practical shelters that balanced protection with resource conservation. The 7 cellars he had constructed throughout the county all followed proven designs that local experience suggested were more than adequate. Weather Bureau folks get nervous every spring, Colbert remarked, while reinforcing his own shelter's entrance hatch. Better safe than sorry, but no need for extraordinary measures. April 23rd brought the first visible indication that this season might differ from conventional patterns. Cloud formations developed what meteorologists called anvil tops, massive thunderheads reaching 40,000 feet with distinctive flattened upper sections. These formations, documented in recent Weather Bureau publications as precursors to severe tornadic activity, now appeared with unsettling frequency over Grayson County. Carrigan made final adjustments to his cellar's ventilation system, adding wire mesh covers to prevent flying debris from blocking critical air passages. He tested the heavy double doors, confirming they swung freely without binding at the hinges. Most significantly, he visited neighbors beyond the immediate settlement, extending invitations that puzzled recipients. If trouble comes, my cellar holds 15 with room to spare, he told the Wilson family, recent arrivals whose farmstead lacked any below-ground shelter. Don't hesitate if skies turn green. The peculiar reference to green skies, another observation documented in Carrigan's notebook, but unfamiliar to most locals, struck some as strange superstition rather than practical warning. Yet when Sheriff Miller returned from Sherman on May 5th, with reports of devastating storms throughout eastern Kansas, Carrigan's preparations seemed increasingly justified. 3 dead near Topeka, Miller reported during an impromptu gathering at Thornton's store. Weather Bureau says the system's moving south-southeast along a cold front. The atmospheric measurements Carrigan had been tracking now showed alarming patterns. Barometric pressure had dropped to 28.7 inches. Humidity levels had risen to 87%, and wind direction had shifted from steady southerly flows to erratic patterns that changed hourly. These conditions, documented in meteorological journals he had studied during Illinois winters, suggested ideal tornado formation environments. Jenkins, Colbert, and other established settlers maintained their standard precautions while acknowledging the unusual conditions. Their cellars, which had served through typical Texas thunderstorms, seemed adequate protection against reasonable threats. Yet, as May 15th approached with increasingly unstable weather patterns, the community found itself divided between conventional confidence and growing unease about what mathematical calculations and scientific observations suggested might be developing. What remained uncertain was whether decades of local experience would prove sufficient against a storm system that scientific instruments suggested would exceed historical precedents. The question that had begun with Carrigan's arrival now approached its definitive answer. Would traditional shelter designs withstand forces that modern meteorological understanding was only beginning to measure and predict? May 15th, 1896, arrived beneath an ominous sky unlike anything Grayson County residents had witnessed in living memory. The morning air hung unnaturally still, with barometric pressure readings plummeting to 28.4 inches by noon. The horizon to the southwest had acquired the greenish tint that Carrigan's notebook had documented as indicative of severe rotation. By 2 hours in the afternoon, clouds had formed the distinctive hook pattern that the Weather Bureau had recently classified as the most dangerous formation in meteorological observations. Sheriff Miller rode between farms urging families to prepare for immediate shelter. "Telegraphs down to Dallas," he reported grimly at the Jenkins homestead. Last message reported a massive storm system tracking northeast, directly toward Grayson County. At 3:17 p.m., the distinctive freight train roar that survivors would later describe as the sound of Judgment Day announced the tornado's arrival. The vortex that descended from cloud base to ground measured approximately 800 yards in width, a monster by any historical standard. Later, Weather Bureau analysis would classify it as an F4 tornado, with wind speeds exceeding 175 miles per hour and destructive force capable of leveling even well-built structures. Thomas Jenkins hurried his wife and 3 children into their standard 8x8 cellar as the roar intensified. The single entrance hatch, designed to keep out rain and provide basic protection during typical storms, faced directly southwest, precisely the direction from which the tornado approached. The family huddled in the confined space, feeling the increasing pressure as the storm drew near. Benjamin Colbert likewise directed his family into their conventional shelter. Designed according to the same principles he had applied to 7 others throughout the county. The standardized dimensions provided 64 square feet of space, adequate for his family of 4 under normal circumstances, with a single ventilation pipe extending 12 inches above ground level. The Wilson family, recent arrivals with no completed cellar, had reluctantly accepted Carrigan's invitation and arrived at his property 30 minutes before the storm hit. They joined the Carrigan household in the 12x16 chamber, where Joseph had already arranged supplies in the methodical manner documented in his notebook. Then, in a development that would permanently transform Grayson County's understanding of storm protection, the Jenkins' teenage son appeared at Carrigan's property, breathlessly reporting that their cellar door had jammed from outside pressure. Moments later, the Colberts arrived in their wagon, having abandoned their own shelter after debris had blocked their single ventilation pipe. 15 people, 3 complete families plus Sheriff Miller, who had been caught mid-route, crowded into Carrigan's oversized storm cellar as the tornado struck with full force. The offset entrance design prevented direct wind pressure from reaching the main chamber doors. The 4 ventilation pipes, positioned at carefully calculated intervals around the perimeter, maintained breathable air despite 2 becoming partially obstructed by flying debris. Most critically, the diagonal bracing system in all 8 corners distributed the immense lateral pressure throughout the entire structure, rather than concentrating force on individual support posts. The technical specifications that had seemed excessive during construction now demonstrated their life-saving purpose. The structure withstood pressures that calculations later estimated at 130 pounds per square inch, well beyond the 85 psi failure point of standard vertical supports. But below the 140 psi threshold, Carrigan's design had been engineered to withstand. For 47 minutes, the 15 occupants huddled in the chamber, designed for precisely this capacity. Children whimpered in the dimly lit space as adults maintained forced calm. Above them, the tornado obliterated structures that generations of Texas experience had deemed adequate. Standard cellars throughout the affected area suffered catastrophic failures. Entrance hatches torn away by direct wind exposure, ventilation systems blocked or damaged beyond function, and in 3 documented cases, complete structural collapse when support timbers failed under lateral pressure. "The air's moving," Sheriff Miller noted with surprise, feeling the gentle but persistent circulation from Carrigan's quadruple ventilation system despite the chaos above ground. "Pressure equalization," Carrigan explained quietly, monitoring his pocket barometer as the needle fluctuated wildly. Without it, the differential between inside and outside can reach structural failure thresholds. Thomas Jenkins, whose family would likely have perished in their collapsed cellar, watched Carrigan with newfound respect. "What else did they teach you in Illinois that we missed in Texas?" The answer lay in the careful measurements, calculated angles, and scientific principles that had informed every aspect of Carrigan's design, knowledge that no amount of local experience could replace without access to the emerging science of severe weather protection. As the storm finally passed overhead, leaving devastation in its wake, 15 survivors prepared to emerge into a landscape transformed both physically by nature's fury and intellectually by the vindication of one man's understanding of forces that traditional wisdom had never fully comprehended. The devastation revealed by morning light on May 16, 1896, confirmed what the fortunate survivors already knew. Conventional wisdom regarding storm cellar construction had failed catastrophically. County assessment teams documented the sobering statistics. 80% of standard 8x8 cellars had suffered structural damage, rendering them partially or completely unusable. 6 had experienced catastrophic entrance failures, where direct wind exposure ripped away doors and damaged accessways. 4 reported ventilation system collapse that would have caused suffocation and extended occupancy. Most alarmingly, 3 had completely failed structurally when support timbers snapped under lateral pressure that exceeded their design tolerances. Sheriff Miller organized the damage assessment with methodical precision that matched Carrigan's own approach to construction. "We need to understand exactly why some shelters failed while others survived," he announced at an emergency community gathering. "Folks' lives depend on getting this right before the next big storm." Benjamin Colbert, whose professional reputation had rested on conventional construction methods, approached Carrigan with uncharacteristic humility. "I'd like to see your original drawings," he requested, notebook in hand. "There's principles at work here I need to understand." The technical specifications that had once seemed wasteful excess now represented the difference between life and death. Carrigan's offset entrance design had prevented the direct wind pressure that destroyed conventional doors. His quadruple ventilation system maintained breathable air despite 2 pipes becoming obstructed by debris. Most significantly, the diagonal bracing in all 8 corners distributed lateral pressure throughout the entire structure, rather than concentrating force on individual support posts. "It's not just about size," Carrigan explained as neighbors crowded around his shelter, now the center of intense community interest. "It's about understanding how wind force translates to structural pressure points." By June 1896, the construction boom began. 7 families contracted Colbert to build new cellars according to what locals now called Carrigan specifications. The dimensions, 12 feet by 16 feet with 8-foot ceiling height, became standard for any family with 5 or more members. The offset entrance with 90-degree turns appeared in every new design. Diagonal corner bracing replaced conventional vertical posts throughout the county. Thomas Jenkins, whose standard cellar had collapsed completely, became an unlikely advocate for the new approach. "I've been building wrong for 15 years, he admitted during the June community meeting. Nearly cost my family their lives because I trusted convention over science." The knowledge transfer process that followed revealed the depth of technical expertise underlying Carrigan's approach. He conducted workshops demonstrating proper diagonal brace cutting and fitting techniques. He explained ventilation placement principles that ensured cross airflow even when partially obstructed. Most importantly, he shared the meteorological understanding that had informed his original design, the scientific principles of tornado formation and behavior, documented in Weather Bureau bulletins, but never previously incorporated into local building practices. By spring 1897, 23 Carrigan cellars had been completed throughout Grayson County. County records documented the specifications in official building recommendations, marking the first time scientific principles had been formally incorporated into local construction standards. Visitors from neighboring counties traveled specifically to examine the innovative designs, spreading the approach throughout North Texas and eventually into Oklahoma Territory. The ultimate validation came during the tornado outbreak of 1902, when 3 severe storms struck the region within a 2-week period. The survival rate in structures built to Carrigan specifications reached 96%, while conventional cellars again suffered significant failures. Weather Bureau officials visited specifically to document the construction differences, incorporating the findings into national recommendations that would influence storm protection design for generations. Joseph Carrigan never sought recognition for his contribution to community safety. His leather-bound notebook, filled with careful measurements and observations, remained his private reference rather than a source of public acclaim. Yet his legacy took physical form in every diagonal brace, offset entrance, and properly sized family shelter constructed throughout the region. By 1925, when the first rudimentary tornado warning systems began development, the shelters throughout North Texas had already incorporated what meteorologists would later confirm as scientifically sound protection principles. Modified Carrigan cellars remained in use well into the modern era, their effectiveness verified by both experience and engineering analysis. The man once mocked for wasting valuable farmland on an oversized hole had transformed regional understanding of severe weather protection through practical application of scientific knowledge that conventional wisdom had never incorporated. One Illinois farmer's refusal to accept local tradition over documented science had saved 3 families immediately, and countless more in the generations that followed. The oversized cellar that had once symbolized foolish excess became the standard against which all future storm protection would be measured.